A sultry summer evening in the city center. The sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the streets in semi-darkness, illuminated only by neon signs and street lamps. The air was tense, as before a thunderstorm, and the empty streets seemed suspiciously quiet. On the corner of one of these streets, rude shouts and the sound of heavy footsteps were heard. A man, black and dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, stood at the drink stand, holding a bottle of water. He had just left work after a long day and decided to make a quick stop to refresh himself before heading home. All was calm until a police car pulled up and 2 white police officers got out. "Hey, you!" one of them shouted, pointing at the man. "What are you doing here?" The man, slightly surprised, answered politely, "I just bought some water. I'm tired from work." But something in his tone, perhaps simple fatigue or perhaps the police, being determined to find a problem where there was none, aroused suspicion in one of them. "Work, you say?" the first officers asked mockingly, looking the man up and down. "That doesn't look like work. You seem too relaxed. You didn't steal, did you?" The man frowned, not understanding where such assumptions came from. "No, I just paid for the water," he answered calmly, showing the receipt. But this was not enough for the officers. The second policeman, standing slightly behind, said mockingly, "A check. Well, we know such tricks. Maybe you stole the water or something worse." The tension grew. The men began to understand that his answers, no matter how reasonable, were of no interest to these people. They were looking for a pretext. "Look," he said, trying to remain calm, "I just want to go home. If you have any questions, ask the clerk. He'll confirm that I paid." But the man's words only angered the first policeman. "Oh, you're being smart too," he shouted, taking a step forward. "You think you can tell me what to do?" The man felt a cold fear run through him. He had done nothing wrong, but it didn't matter. The police were determined to show their authority, no matter the circumstances. Without warning, the first officers grabbed his arm, snatching the water bottle and throwing it on the ground. "Let's see what else you've got," he said, starting to search the man's pockets despite his protest. "I didn't do anything." The man tried to object, but the second officers immediately stepped closer, pushing him against the wall. "Now you've started talking," he said with a grin. "Let's see how long you can hold out." The man felt his world crumble. No matter what he said or did, these people would decide he was guilty. The reason, probably one, and they would never say it out loud. The man stood backed against the wall, his breathing growing heavier. The first officers continued to search his pockets, throwing his keys and phone onto the ground as if they were evidence against him. The second officer stood by, his face set in a cold satisfaction, as if he was enjoying what was happening. "Well, Mr. Law-abiding citizen," the first policeman chuckled, taking out the man's wallet. "Let's see what we have here. Maybe fake documents. Or are you living under a false name?" The man held his breath, trying not to show fear. He knew that any attempt to object would only make the situation worse. "This is my wallet," he said quietly, looking the officers in the eye. "Everything in there is legal." "Legal?" snorted the second policeman, joining the conversation. "It's funny to hear that from someone like you. You have too many law-abiding people who end up in our reports." The man felt his heart squeeze. The words were like blows, each one laced with contempt. "Why are you talking to me like that?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "I didn't do anything. I just bought water." The first officers gave him a sharp look. "And we'll decide what you did or didn't do," he said, waving the man's wallet in his face. "You think you can walk our streets, do whatever you want, and no one will notice? Your streets," the man repeated quietly, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "Aren't they for everyone?" These words seemed to only add fuel to the fire. The second policeman took a step forward, his voice becoming more aggressive. "For everyone," he shouted. "Have you forgotten where you are? We make the rules here. You're just, well, you know." The man felt his insides twist. Every word these people said was filled with hatred that they didn't even try to hide. But he knew that he was helpless now. The only thing he could do was stand, listen, and hope that it would all end. "I want you to stop," he said firmly, looking straight at the first policeman. "You're violating my rights." The first officers laughed, and his laughter echoed off the walls. "Your rights," he said, approaching the man. "Your rights mean nothing as long as we're here." The anxiety grew with each passing second. The man understood that the situation was getting worse, but deep down he knew his strength was in his truth. even if no one wanted to hear it. The policeman's words were heavy as stones, and each one left a wound deeper than the last. The man stood pressed against the wall, his body tense as a taut string. His eyes, full of determination, looked at the officers, but inside he was shaking. He knew that every second of this humiliation was a test of his endurance. "Look at him," the first policeman said mockingly, turning to his partner. "Thinks he's better than us. Maybe he's one of those guys who thinks he's above the law." The second officers laughed loudly, nodding in agreement. "There are hundreds of people like him here. They all sing the same song, 'I'm not guilty,' and every time it's the same thing." The man, feeling a heaviness growing in his chest, calmly replied, "I didn't do anything wrong. You know that? You're just looking for an excuse." "A reason?" The first officer stepped closer, his face twisted into a grimace. "We don't need a reason to deal with the likes of you." He pushed the man with his shoulder, causing him to press himself even further against the cold wall. The man took a deep breath, trying not to let his anger get the better of him. "Why are you treating me like this?" he asked, his voice sounding more tired than angry. "I don't deserve this." "Deserved it?" The officer smirked, his eyes flashing with contempt. "And who decides what you deserve?" "You. We decide here." The second officers, who had been silently watching until then, pulled a notebook out of his pocket and began to write something, loudly announcing, "Well, let's see. Unprovoked behavior, suspicious presence on the premises. Maybe we should add disobeying the police. No one's going to look into it anyway." "That's not true," the man replied sharply, his voice growing louder. "You're just making this up." These words made the first officers chuckle again. He came closer, lowering his head so that their eyes were almost at the same level. "Who do you think will listen to you?" he hissed. "You think anyone will take your side?" The man lowered his eyes. He felt his voice disappearing in this room, like a drop of water in the desert. He tried to maintain his dignity, but blows of humiliation, one after another, were destroying his armor. "Why do you hate me so much?" he asked quietly, looking away. "It's not hate, but," the second officers replied, grinning, "it's just the way things are. You're nothing more than a problem to be solved." The words hung in the air like a hammer blow, shattering the last of the silence. The man realized that he could no longer convince them of his innocence. All he could do was stand, even when they tried to tear his dignity apart. He decided to hold on until the end. The man remained against the wall, trying his best to remain calm, although his inner world was in turmoil. The policemen, enjoying their supposed power, continued their taunts. The first officers took a step back, his eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. "You think we'll stop?" he snapped, shifting his baton from one end to the other. "You think your silence or your pathetic excuses mean anything?" The man exhaled slowly, trying not to panic. "I don't have to prove anything," he said calmly, but there was steel in his voice. "You've already decided everything for me." These words seemed to add fuel to the fire. The second officer stepped closer, something like anger flashing at his eyes. "You dare talk to us like that?" he shouted, glaring at the man. "Do you think you can change anything?" "Perhaps not me," the man replied, looking up, "but truth always wins." These words caused a brief confusion among the policemen. However, it quickly turned to irritation. The first officer slammed his fist into his palm, as if testing his own strength. "True," he repeated mockingly. "What other truth? There is only one truth in this city, the one we write." But something began to change. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching the scene of the crime was heard on the street. The second officers looked back, his smug smile fading slightly. In the distance, the silhouette of a tall man in a formal suit appeared. His steps were confident, his gaze focused. This man clearly knew where he was going, and why. The first officers noticed his partner's movement and looked in the direction too. He was silent for a second, then swore quietly. "Who is it?" asked the second officers, a note of concern creeping into his voice. The man against the wall finally smiled, his gaze warming despite the pain he was feeling. "This is my brother," he said, looking straight at the officers. "And he's not here to joke." The footsteps were getting closer. The figure of the man became more distinct. It was a tall man. He was holding a briefcase in his hands, and a badge was shining on the lapel of his jacket. It was the local prosecutor, whose reputation was known far beyond the city. "Good evening," the prosecutor said, approaching the police officers. His voice was even, but there was authority in it. "I have a question. What's going on here?" The first officer quickly hid the baton behind his back, his face losing all confidence. This is just a routine check, sir, he muttered, taking a step back. This man has aroused suspicion. Suspicions? The prosecutor interrupted, his voice growing colder. Are you aware that this man is my brother, and that I have already sent a request for your actions in the last hours? The prosecutor's words came out of nowhere. The second officer turned pale, his phone falling from his hands. The first officer tried to speak, but the words were stuck in his throat. The man against the wall finally straightened up, feeling that the situation was beginning to change. Now I'm going to ask you a question, the prosecutor continued, his gaze turning icy. Did you really think you could get away with this? Silence hung in the air, but there was power in that silence. The policemen realized that their power was gone. All they could do was stand silently, knowing that the truth was finally beginning to win. The policeman, his face now somewhat smug, stepped forward. His voice was loud again, but there was a note of nervousness in it, like that of a man who knows the ground beneath his feet is crumbling, but still clings to the illusion of control. You think your brother will change anything? He blurted out, looking straight into the eyes of the man he had just humiliated. You're still nobody. One phone call and you'll be out of this town. No one needs you or your truth. The man pressed against the wall no longer tried to look away. His eyes were now filled with something that made the officers freeze for a split second. It wasn't anger or fear. It was a firm conviction that couldn't be broken by words or actions. I'm not afraid of you, the man said quietly, his voice firm as thunder before a storm. You can say anything, do anything, but the truth is here, and you know it. The cop clenched his fists, his face turning purple. His partner, still standing to the side, looked around nervously, as if searching for a way out of this situation. But the first officer was not going to give up. You think you're a hero? He hissed, pointing a finger at the man. You're just dirt on my boots. You'll be gone, and no one will even notice. He slammed his fist into the wall next to the man's face, trying to scare him. The sound was loud and sharp, but the man didn't even blink. His gaze remained calm and confident. At that moment, the prosecutor's figure came so close that it became visible to everyone. His step was firm, his face concentrated. He saw the scene, heard the officer's words, and stopped a few steps away. Larson, the prosecutor said loudly, his voice like an icy wind that made you shudder. Are you finished? The policeman turned, his eyes wide with surprise. He frowned like an animal caught in a trap. Sir, he began, trying to find an excuse, but the words wouldn't come. You know what's most amazing about people like you? The prosecutor continued, his tone even but cold. You always think you're getting away with it, but every time you step out of line, you forget you're being watched. And today is the day too many people have been watching you. The policeman began to back away, his face growing even paler. His partner, who had remained silent until now, nervously put his phone in his pocket and took a step back. It was a mistake, sir, the partner began, but the prosecutor raised his hand to stop him. A mistake, he repeated, his gaze growing even harder. You call bullying and threats a mistake? The man, who had been standing against the wall all this time, finally stepped forward. His face was calm, but inside he was seething with a mixture of relief and righteous anger. He looked at the officers, who had been shouting at him, and said quietly, Now you understand what it means to be caught for your actions. The policeman lowered his eyes, his voice becoming barely audible. I didn't mean to, he muttered. But now words meant nothing. The truth he had ignored for so long had come crashing down on him, and there was no way out. The silence that followed spoke louder than words. The silence that fell over the street was ringing and unnatural. Officer Larson stood with his head down, his gaze wandering somewhere between the asphalt and the toes of his boots. His partner nervously fiddled with his belt, avoiding eye contact with anyone present. But the silence was not empty. It was charged with energy, tension, like before a thunderstorm, when the air is thick with electricity. The prosecutor stepped forward, his face cool and impassive, but his every movement threatening. He looked at Larson, as if assessing him as a useless tool to be discarded. Larson, you think you play by your own rules, he began, his voice level but steely. But there are things in this world you can't control. You made a mistake today, but the problem is that mistake is bigger than you. Larson looked up, a mixture of fear and bewilderment in his eyes. He started to say something, but the prosecutor silenced him with a gesture. You think this is the end? The prosecutor continued, not raising his voice, but each word cutting through the air like a blade. You haven't even begun to understand where you've ended up. At that moment, something unexpected happened. A woman came out of a nearby house, holding a phone in her hands. Her face was tense, but her eyes were filled with determination. I wrote everything down, she said loudly, her voice breaking the silence like a bolt from the blue. Everyone present turned to look at her. Larson frowned, his face growing even paler. His partner took a step back, as if he wanted to hide in the shadows. What do you mean? Larson muttered, trying to maintain the last of his confidence. The woman picked up the phone and showed the screen. I saw it all, she said, her voice firm. How you threatened that man, how you humiliated him, and how you said he had no rights. Now it's all in my hands. Larson took a step forward, his voice shaking with both anger and fear. You can't use that, he said, trying to sound menacing. It's illegal. The prosecutor chuckled, his smile icy. Larson, he said, turning to the officers, are you really going to start talking about legality after what you did? The woman took a step closer, her gaze full of contempt. I'm not afraid of you, she said to Larson, and I won't let you hide it. But it didn't end there. Sirens began to sound in the distance. These weren't regular patrol cars, but a signal that an internal affairs team was approaching. The prosecutor pulled out his phone, made a few calls, and turned to Larson. You thought today was an ordinary day, he said, but now you'll know what it's like when the truth comes out. Larson tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of approaching cars. All he could do was stand there, stunned, feeling his world crumble under the weight of his own actions. The man who had been standing against the wall all this time took a step forward. His face was calm, but his eyes showed a mixture of relief and fatigue. Truth always finds a way, he said quietly, but the words sounded louder than all of Larson's shouts. The sirens of the approaching cars grew louder, their sound cutting through the tense silence of the street. Officer Larson stood motionless, his face twisted in panic in a tentative attempt to maintain what was left of his authority. His partner, hands trembling openly, cowered in the shadows, as if hoping that if he was quiet enough, he would go unnoticed. The prosecutor remained standing like a statue, looking at Larson as if he were not a person, but a problem that needed to be solved. The man who had been the victim of bullying all this time stepped forward. An hour ago, his voice had been trembling with humiliation, and his gaze was full of pain. Now, there was a quiet strength in his eyes. He raised his hand, pointing at the woman with the phone. You did what I could never do, he said, his voice calm but grateful. You gave this moment a witness, and for that, I thank you. The woman nodded, her hands shaking, but she didn't put the phone down. Larson swallowed nervously and turned to the prosecutor, his voice growing more plaintive. Sir, it's a misunderstanding, he began, trying to justify himself. We were just doing our job. Hey, hear our suspicion. We thought. You thought so? The prosecutor interrupted, his voice like a hammer blow. Really? You call this work? Humiliation, threats, violence. This is your work. Larson opened his mouth to object, but said nothing. His partner, sensing that the situation was getting out of hand, tried to take a step back, but the prosecutor turned to him. And you, he said, his voice cold. You stood there and did nothing. You recorded all this as if it were a performance. And now, you want to tell me you're innocent. The partner frowned, his face white as chalk. He found no words, only lowered his head, avoiding the prosecutor's gaze. The man who had been standing by the wall all this time took another step forward. Now his voice sounded louder. You know what's the worst part about this? He said, his eyes flashing. You don't even think you've done anything wrong. You think it's okay. The sirens were very close, and soon two internal investigation vehicles pulled up next to each other. Men in formal suits got out, their faces focused and unyielding. They approached the prosecutor, and one of them nodded briefly. We're ready, he said. The materials are collected. We know what happened. Larson took a step back, his hands raised as if trying to defend himself from an invisible accusation. Wait, he cried, his voice full of panic. It was a mistake. We didn't mean to. No, you wanted to. The prosecutor interrupted. You made a choice, and now you will answer for that choice. The internal affairs officers moved in, their movements swift and professional. Larson and his partner were handcuffed, Their faces contorted as the control they had held for so long was now slipping from their grasp. The crowd that had gathered around by now began to whisper. Some took a video of what was happening. Others stood there dumbfounded. The woman with the phone turned off the recording and looked at the man, who was now standing as straight as ever. "You did it?" she said quietly. "We did it," he replied, his voice full of gratitude. The prosecutor stepped forward, his gaze falling on the man who had been the victim for so long. He extended his hand and said, "Now everything will change, and we will start from this moment." And, although the night still enveloped the streets, it seemed that somewhere in the distance the light of a new day was beginning to break through. The night was deepening, leaving the streets dimly lit by street lamps whose bulbs trembled in the wind. The crowd gathered around the scene of the crime grew denser. Some stood silently, others whispered, exchanging glances of doubt and fear. In the center of this tense circle, the man who had so recently been a victim now stood confidently, his gaze directed at the police officers whose hands were cuffed. But the tension was still in the air, as if something greater was about to happen. Officer Larson, handcuffed, was still trying to maintain the appearance of control. His face went from pale to red with rage, and he gritted his teeth and blurted out, "You think this is the end?" His voice was low, but there was a challenge in it. "You think your justice means anything? We protect this city, and people like him." He nodded toward the man. "Only cause trouble." Larson's words caused an uproar in the crowd. People began to murmur indignantly, but the man standing in the center raised his hand, calling for silence. His face remained calm, but there was steel in his eyes. "You still don't understand," he said, his voice breaking through the silence like thunder. "Your time is over. There is no more room in this world for your hatred." "My hatred?" Larson laughed, but there was no longer confidence in his laughter. "You think anyone will take your side? You'll always be an outsider. Always." The words, filled with contempt, hit like a hammer, but the man didn't even flinch. He stepped closer to Larson, his eyes full of strength. "Aliens," he said. "No, you are the alien now. You and those who think like you." Silence fell again. The prosecutor, who had been watching the proceedings all this time, stepped forward. His voice sounded like a final verdict. "Larson, you lived for a long time thinking you could get away with it. You used your power to humiliate and destroy, but now your power is over. This city no longer belongs to your kind." Larson tried to speak again, but his voice was lost in the noise of the crowd. People began to speak louder, their indignation growing into open condemnation. The woman with the phone, who had recorded everything from the beginning, held up the device, showing the screen to those around her. "It's not just us who see this," she said loudly. "The whole world will see this." Larson finally fell silent. His partner, who had been trying to remain in the shadows until now, stepped forward and whispered, "Larson, we had to stop. We've gone too far." "Too far," Larson croaked, but his voice was no longer confident. He knew that control was slipping, that his words meant nothing anymore. The crowd began to part to allow internal affairs officers to come forward to escort Larson and his partner. The man they had humiliated stood his ground, watching as justice was slowly but surely served. But there was still a heavy feeling in his soul. Yes, it was a victory, but it had come at a high price, and he knew there was still a long way to go before this world could truly change. And as night fell upon the city again, it seemed as if something dark still lurked in its shadows, but now there was a light that was beginning to grow and showed no sign of dying down. Silence fell like an icy blanket over the street as one of the internal affairs officers pulled out a clipboard and began flipping through documents. His concentrated face suddenly took on a look of surprise. He looked up at the man who had been standing in the center of the room, his gaze full of respect, and then at Larson. "Larson," he began, his voice strained like a string about to snap, "do you even realize what you've done?" Larson narrowed his eyes, his face turning pale. "What do you mean?" he asked, but there was already uncertainty in his voice. The man who had endured so much humiliation and brutality stepped forward. His posture was straight, his gaze firm. He was no longer someone who could be broken by words or actions. He was now a man whose truth was about to be revealed. "You didn't seem to ask who I was before you started showing off your power," he said, his voice even but strong. "Perhaps that's your biggest mistake." The prosecutor smiled slightly at the corner of his lips, his gaze becoming sharp as a blade. "Larson," He continued, "You really don't realize who you're dealing with. Let me explain. This man is a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. He's one of the leading civil rights advocates in the country." The prosecutor's words fell like a bolt from the blue. Larson Frownzy, his face white as chalk, his partner, who had been trying to remain inconspicuous all this time, now looked as if he wanted to vanish into thin air. "A lawyer," Larson muttered, but his voice was barely audible. "That's impossible." "This is reality, Larson," the prosecutor replied, his voice icy with confidence. "The man you humiliated and threatened, the man you thought was a nobody, is the one who has the power to change your life forever. The man, who is now the focus of everyone's attention, took another step forward, his voice loud and confident. "You thought you had power over me, but all your power is an illusion. Today, I am not only defending myself, I am defending all those whom you and those like you have tried to break." The crowd frowned. Larson took a step back, his hands shaking, though he tried to hide it. His partner, already completely overwhelmed, was barely breathing. "Look," Larson began, but his voice was breaking. It was a misunderstanding. "I didn't know." "You didn't know because you never wanted to know," the man interrupted. "You don't care who's in front of you. For you, it's always a question of power. But now you'll know what it's like to have power used against you." At this point, the internal investigation officers came closer, their movements quick and decisive. One of them looked at the prosecutor and said, "We are ready to begin the process. We have everything we need." Larson tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His eyes darted from the prosecutor to the man, whose confidence now overwhelmed any attempt he made to resist. "Please," he finally whispered, his voice quiet, almost plaintive. "I can explain everything." But there was no answer. Instead, the man simply turned to the prosecutor and said, "Let the law have its say." Larson, feeling control slipping away, took one last step back. Now he was the one who was afraid, the one who was looking for salvation. But there was no salvation, only the cold, inescapable truth. A heavy silence fell over the street, broken by the flickering streetlights and the tense whispers of the crowd. Larson, whose confidence had seemed unshakable before, now stood like a statue, his eyes darting about as if he were searching for a way to escape. But there was nowhere to run. The space around him was closing in like a trap. Slowly but surely, his partner, standing next to him, took a step back, but his silence was not supportive but an attempt to distance himself, to leave Larson alone with his growing fear. "Look, this is some kind of misunderstanding," Larson managed, his voice shaking as if it were crashing against its own echo. "We were just doing our jobs. I didn't know who he was." His words fell on deaf ears. The crowd, now more like a silent court, looked at him expectantly. The prosecutor stepped forward, his gaze heavy, almost penetrating. He studied Larson silently, letting him feel the weight of the moment. "Didn't know," the prosecutor finally said, his voice as icy and even as a knife blade. "That's your excuse. Didn't know. And you think that frees you from responsibility?" Larson frowned as if struck by lightning, his mouth open to protest, but he found no words. The fear that had been slowly creeping into his consciousness now took over completely. He felt cold sweat trickling down his back, and his hands were shaking despite his efforts to maintain a semblance of control. I was just following orders," he managed, hoping the words would save him. We saw suspicious behavior. It was a routine check, standard check." The prosecutor interrupted, his voice growing louder, like thunder breaking the silence. "You call humiliation and threat standard procedure. You call violence work." Every word the prosecutor said hit Larson like a hammer. He felt his knees buckle slightly, but he forced himself to stand up straight. It felt like the whole world was looking at him now, and every look was filled with condemnation. The man, who had been standing silently all this time, stepped forward. His posture was proud, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but with such confidence that it went right to the bone. "You used your power to humiliate me because you thought I was helpless," he said, his words like a death sentence. "You laughed at me because you thought I couldn't fight back, but now you realize I'm not someone you can break." Larson felt something inside him break. The fear he had tried to ignore had taken over completely. His hands were shaking, and his breathing was fast and shallow. He looked around, hoping to find someone to support him, but his partner only looked away, and the crowd stood silent, their faces a mixture of anger and contempt. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. I didn't mean to, but no one was listening. I see. Officers who had been standing off to the side now began to move closer. Their gazes were focused, their movements precise. Larson felt his heart begin to beat faster. He realized that his confidence had evaporated, leaving only fear and the awareness of his own vulnerability. Larson, the prosecutor said, his voice quiet again but no less menacing. You thought you had power. You thought you were untouchable. But power isn't a privilege. It's a responsibility. And you failed? The prosecutor's words silenced Larson completely. His arms fell limply at his sides, and his gaze was fixed on the void. He knew it was all over. There was no longer a mask of confidence, only fear of the inevitable retribution for his actions. The crowd gathered around, watched in complete silence, as if each person was afraid to move, lest they disturb the tension that hung in the air. Larson stood transfixed, his face pale, his eyes darting about like a cornered animal. He looked for a way out, but found only disapproving looks from the crowd, from his partner, from the prosecutor, and, most of all, from the man he was trying so desperately to humiliate. The man, the one Larson had tried to break, stood confidently, his gaze no longer full of fear, but determination. The change was palpable. Everyone could feel his strength, not physical, but a strength of spirit that had become unyielding to police brutality. You lived for a long time thinking you could do whatever you wanted, the man said, his voice level but with a power that made Larson shudder. But every time you crossed the line, you brought yourself closer to this moment. The prosecutor, who had stood motionless all this time, stepped forward, his eyes seeming to pierce Larson's soul, robbing him of the last vestige of confidence. Larson, he began slowly, as if weighing each word, your actions today were not just a mistake, they were a crime. You tried to use your power to break another man, but you forgot that power is not a protection from the law. It is part of it. Larson took a step back, his hands shaking. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His partner, standing nearby, turned away, as if trying to hide his presence. Even he now realized that an alliance with Larson no longer made sense. The crowd began to move closer, forming a tyrene around the stage. People who had been afraid to speak before now looked at the man with respect and at Larson with anger. Look, I can't explain, Larson managed, his voice plaintive, like a man who knew his time was running out. It was a misunderstanding. The man interrupted, his voice as sharp as a whip. You call this just? You threatened me. You humiliated me. You tried to ruin my life. And this is just? No, Larson, you made a choice. And now you're learning that every choice has consequences. At that moment, the internal investigation officers came closer. One of them took out handcuffs and looked at the prosecutor, waiting for a signal. The prosecutor nodded. Take him, he said, and make sure all the evidence is handed over to me personally. This case will be an example of how no one is above the law. The officers approached Larson, who was now completely paralyzed with fear. His hands shook as they were handcuffed. He tried to speak, but his voice broke. Please, I can't fix this, he begged, but no one listened. The crowd grew louder, their voices expressing mixed emotions, anger, relief, delight. The woman with the phone held it up, filming Larson being led away to a patrol car. His partner stood off to the side, seemingly frowning, waiting his turn. The man who had suffered so much injustice finally took a deep breath. He turned to the prosecutor and said, Thank you for making the right choice. The prosecutor looked at him. His face was serious, but there was a shadow of respect in his eyes. It's not just my choice, he replied. It's our duty. You've shown yourself worthy of more than this injustice. Now we're going to fix it. And though the night still shrouded the streets, it seemed that the light of justice was beginning to shine from this scene. The man felt that his fight had only just begun, but he was no longer alone. He was no longer just a victim, but a symbol of resistance and strength. The action on the street continued for a long time. The crowd continued to thicken, watching as the internal affairs officers escorted Larson and his partner to the patrol car. The noise of conversation grew, growing louder with each passing moment. People exchanged opinions, some expressing relief, others fury. The night became an arbiter, where everyone was a witness to a truth that could not be hidden. The man at the center of all this drama stood tall, his posture calm but his eyes tired. He watched Larson, once confident in his power, now being led away under the disapproving gaze of the crowd. Larson tried to speak, his lips moving but no sound coming out. His face was gray, as if all the blood had left his body. He realized that it had now become a symbol of what it meant to abuse one's power. The prosecutor stepped closer to the man, his stern gaze softening. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice even but firm. "We will begin an investigation that will reveal everything that was hidden beneath these forms, and you, of all people, know how important that is." The man nodded, his gaze focused. He knew this moment was not only his personal victory, but also an opportunity for many others whose voices had previously gone unheard. "This isn't just my fight," he said quietly, but there was a power in his words that made the prosecutor freeze. "This is a fight for everyone who was broken, who was afraid to speak, and I will do everything to make sure they are heard." The prosecutor nodded, his face expressing respect. "You've already done more than many could," he said, "but remember, it's a long road, and along the way, there will be many who will try to stop you." The man responded with a look that showed neither fear nor doubt. "Let them try," he said, his voice firm. Meanwhile, the woman who had been recording everything on her phone approached the man, her face expressing a mixture of relief and pride. "I thought all this would go unnoticed," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "but you proved that it wasn't true. You proved that justice exists." The man smiled. His smile was warm but with a hint of sadness. "Thank you for not standing aside," he said. "This would not have been possible without you." The sirens of the internal affairs vehicles gradually faded, taking with them the officers whose time had run out. The crowd began to disperse, but the atmosphere remained tense. Everyone who witnessed this scene took a piece of this story with them. Stories of struggle, of truth, of how one person can change so much. The night was growing quieter, but it no longer held the oppressive darkness that had once hovered. The light of justice, shining through layers of injustice, was beginning to change everything. The man at the center of this change knew there was much work to do, but he was ready, because he now saw that his voice could be heard, and with every step he took, he was going to prove that justice was not just a word, it was power. The night was already giving way to the first light of dawn, but Larson's soul was growing darker. His confidence, once unshakable, was crumbling, leaving behind emptiness and fear. Now his Saturday in a cramped, impersonal interrogation room, the cold walls seeming to close in around him. His hands were clasped behind his back, handcuffs cutting into his wrists, a reminder of how quickly his life had changed. He tried to find a way to justify his actions, but each explanation sounded weaker than the last. His own thoughts, crashing down like an avalanche, filled his head with despair. In front of him stood the investigator from the Internal Affairs Department, whose face remained impassive as if carved from stone. "Larson," the investigator began, his voice even but firm, "you witnessed how justice can reach anyone. You knew what you were doing, and you understood the consequences, but you still chose the path that led you here." I was just doing my job," Larson muttered, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "I didn't know it would go this far." The investigator leaned closer, his gaze piercing as a needle. "You didn't know," he repeated, "and who gave you the right to use your power to humiliate and intimidate? Who gave you the right to think that you are above the law?" Larson fell silent. His breathing became ragged and sweat trickled down his temples. He looked around the room, but nothing but cold walls met his gaze. No one was on his side anymore. His partner, who had been there before, was now in the next room, equally accountable for his actions. Meanwhile, the man whose determination and fortitude had become the catalyst for change stood in the courthouse, awaiting a decision that could change not only his life, but the lives of many others. The prosecutor who had stood up for him Saturday nearby, preparing for another battle for justice, in his hands. He held a thick folder of evidence collected in the last few hours. "We will prove it," the prosecutor said, his voice confident. "This case will be a signal to everyone that the law works, even when it seems there is no hope." The man nodded, his gaze fixed forward. He knew that this day was not just a day of retribution. This was a day. He had shown that even in the darkest corners of the system, there was light to be found. Larson, alone after the interrogation, was now in a holding cell. The cramped space he had previously used for others was now his world. His thoughts circled like birds of prey, giving him no peace. The faces of those who had hurt, humiliated, and oppressed floated through his mind. These faces became his persecutors, from whom he could find no escape. He pressed himself into the corner of the cell, his hands shaking. The fear he had once inspired in others had now taken over him. Every sound outside the door, every step down the hallway seemed to him to be a harbinger of the inevitable judgment. He tried to stop shaking, but he knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. On the street where it all began, the crowd was slowly dispersing, but there was a sense of change in the air. People were talking to each other, discussing what had happened, sharing their stories, and for the first time in a long time, feeling like their voices were being heard. The man walked out of the courthouse, his steps firm, his eyes fixed on the distance. He knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, but now he was sure it was worth taking. The woman with the phone approached him, her face filled with pride. "You changed something today," she said. "You gave us hope." The man smiled, but his smile was tired. "I did what I had to do," he replied. "Now our job is to continue." And though night turned to day, the light of justice remained in the hearts of everyone who witnessed this story. It was the day when fear gave way to truth, and humiliation to strength. It was the day when the man they tried to break became a symbol of resistance. Friends, how do you like this story? We will be glad to know what you think about this situation. Write your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Have you ever experienced injustice or racism in your life? Share your experiences if you are willing. We value each of you and are grateful that you are with us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos, and like it if this story touched you. We wish you a wonderful day and only positive emotions.